Minister, I only want to take a few minutes to contribute briefly to the bill. And as my colleague, Deputy Michael McGrath, indicated at the outset, our party will be supporting this bill. We welcome it. As he alluded to the fact that at committee stage there was no pre-leg scrutiny, in other words, to facilitate its timely passage. I sat here a few moments ago. A colleague raised the issue and made the comment, well, the government are doing nothing, and I think that's incorrect. But I do think a more fair and reasonable question to ask is, are you doing enough, and are you doing it in a timely fashion? And that question has to be posed in the context of the actions and the recommendations and the associated timelines that were given in the report, the working group's report and their recommendations. And I think when you look at it and analyse it, we have slipped. And I think we've slipped behind that timeline, and that is regrettable. While some of the actions have been delivered, and I'll allude to a couple of them in a moment, some have not. And this particular piece of legislation, my understanding was, the intention when the working group reported, the intention at that point in time was that this legislation would have been enacted last year and operational now. The question now arises, will we even have the legislation complete by the end of 2018? So it's not that the government haven't done anything. It's have they done enough, and have they done it in a timely fashion? And that working group and its recommendations and the associated timelines are the benchmark. That being said, this piece of legislation is important. But in its own right, it's not enough. It's a component, it's one brick in the block to address the issue. The bill enables the central bank to gather the data and to publish it, which is important, and bearing in mind that more than two-thirds, 70% of the claims are settled outside the PIAB. So in that context, to add the transparency, we understand that 80%. In that context, whether it's 70 or 80%, it is the vast majority of cases, and that transparency is needed. And I suppose we might say that the transparency is needed to maybe encourage other companies to enter the insurance market. The data on its own is not going to be sufficient for other companies. They will want to look at the costs, the profit margins and so forth associated. But it does afford an opportunity by making the data transparent. I suppose, Minister, I'm often conscious of the fact that from a government point of view, you quite rightly say that the CSO figures for last year show a decrease in the motor premiums. I think the figure you quote by is 11%. However, I, on the other hand, have to say, what did it go up by in the period 2012 to 2017, which was a lot more, 50. Okay, so while progress has been made, we haven't come back to a level that would account for normal increases. Even if you look at where we are today from 2012, the rate of increase is at an abnormal rate in comparison to cost of living in general. And I think that's a fair point to make. Before I refer to the bill, I suppose an awful lot of us as public reps, we receive complaints from individuals, and you heard colleagues talk about motor insurance, and I suppose that's because so many people have motor insurance policies. And I want to look at motor insurance, but I want to just put on the record that businesses and small businesses are also experiencing severe difficulties, and they're not without victims and other casualties, because if the business survives, the only way it survives is by passing on the cost. So all of us as consumers are paying for this one way or the other. If a business can't bear the cost of their business insurance and can't pass it on, it obviously folds. But if it does survive and passes it on, we as consumers all pay the cost of that. In terms of motor insurance, and I just have a couple of comments in relation to the working group, but I do want to just bring to your attention, Minister, I've said it in this House before and I say it again, that while the global figures indicate that there are decreases, there certainly appears to me to be certain groups and classes of people that are being targeted. Initially it was always the young driver seemed to pay a premium. But I have noticed in my own area, and people coming to me, that there are now additional. Older drivers are at an earlier age facing increases in premiums. People who change their address within a couple of miles of where they live, I have seen with an increase in premium. And in particular, where cars are 10 years and older, they also have experienced increase in premiums. And I think, Minister, it's fair to say that in the modern era, where cars are relatively well maintained, where they're subject to regular NCTs, that a 10-year-old car, and that means today a 2008-year-old car, should not be seen as a liability. And in particular, I was having a chat with someone because I have a son of an age who's looking at a car, you know, and it will be his first car. He's insured, he has his test and whatever. And do you know something? Isn't it? There's something wrong when the cost of the insurance is likely to be more than the cost of the car. Wouldn't we be better ensuring that the car was a better quality and more roadworthy? But the reality is, for many first-time drivers, for many young people who want their own car, in other words, don't want to be a named driver on a parent's car, who want their own car, the likelihood is that the insurance premium is going to be more than the cost of the car. And I think we need to look at that. There is something fundamentally wrong. That needs to be reversed. And I know there are all sorts of technologies that can be used to monitor the speed and driving and so forth. But as a general rule, we need to address that. Minister, I indicated that a number of the actions that were in the working group haven't been progressed as quickly as possible. And I think that's regretful, because the only way we're going to make progress on this is not by individual actions. It's the collective. It's the execution of all of those actions together. So while today we're talking about, you know, a database that will be useful for potential insurers coming to the market, we had also previously talked about a database of uninsured drivers that Gardaí would be able to recognise. There's a cost associated with them. But really and truly, we haven't made the level of progress in those areas that we had anticipated to make. And dealing with one aspect over another is, in my view, I think there needs to be a renewed urgency. And I am conscious, Minister, that you've inherited this programme. You didn't develop it, but you are responsible for its execution. One of the recommendations that hasn't been enacted, and I often wonder why, is that consumers should be informed as to the reason, or maybe reasons, when they get significant premium increases. It's probably the single biggest concern that raises itself, where somebody gets a premium renewal that is 100 or 2 or more an increase on the previous year, and particularly at a time, Minister, when we're in this House talking about whether it's the 2-year effect or the 2017 effect of premium reductions. I think that there is something wrong when somebody gets, without an accident, when they get a new policy that is increased on last year for the same vehicle. They need to be given an explanation as to why that is. Now, I know many of them shop around and often, having shopped around, come back to their own insurer and get a reduction, but that's not good enough. It's sharp practice, to say the least. And I think it's also important that policyholders be informed of claims made against them before a settlement is reached. I'm sure you've heard of cases where this arises, where settlements are made, but the insured party isn't aware that a claim had been made at all. The whole issue of anti-fraud was supposed to be an issue that should have been dealt with last year. There have been lots of talk about it, lots of proposals in terms of how it might be funded, but in terms of its execution, Minister, it hasn't happened as quickly as we would have liked to have seen. So while I came in here this afternoon to acknowledge the work in this piece of legislation, I specifically came in to refer to the fact that this piece of legislation is welcome and being supported, but if the other actions aren't advanced in a timely fashion, I think the impact that we're trying to achieve will not be achieved, and I think that would be regrettable. And I've used the opportunity, maybe not in the correct way, but I've used the opportunity to review some of the actions in that working group's recommendations, and I would appeal to you, Minister, and I do know recently there was the 6th review of it officially, but that review aside, that there be meaningful efforts made to fast-track the actions that have slipped behind their scheduled date. I think that's really, really important. I spoke this afternoon not to delay the legislation because my colleague Deputy McGrath would be quite annoyed. We're supportive of the legislation, but if it's to have what we expect it to do, the other elements of this action plan need to be delivered also. Curran.